Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I'm an emergency room physician at St. Mary's Regional Medical Center in Burlington, Vermont, or at least I was until I submitted my resignation last month. You can call me Dr. Harrison if you want, though most people in the ER just called me Doc during my 12 years there. I've seen everything you can imagine in emergency medicine: car accidents, heart attacks, overdoses, gunshot wounds, and every kind of trauma the human body can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about medicine, and ultimately led me to leave the profession entirely. St. Mary's is a Level 2 trauma center serving central Vermont and parts of New Hampshire. It's a modern facility built in the 1990s with a 24-bed emergency department that handles about 45,000 patients per year. During my time there, I worked primarily night shifts, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., because I preferred the pace and the types of cases we typically saw after dark. Night shifts in emergency medicine are unpredictable. You might have 6 hours of relative quiet followed by 2 hours of absolute chaos, or you might be running non-stop from the moment you clock in. The night of October 15, 2022 was shaping up to be one of the quiet ones. It was a Saturday, which usually meant we'd see our share of alcohol-related incidents, domestic disputes, and the occasional overdose. But the weather was cold and rainy, the kind of night that keeps most people indoors. I had been on shift since 7 p.m., and by 2:30 a.m. we had only seen a handful of patients: a college student with alcohol poisoning, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be acid reflux, and a construction worker who had cut his hand on a piece of metal and needed stitches. I was catching up on paperwork in the physician's lounge when my pager went off at 2:47 a.m. The message was from our charge nurse, Linda Martinez, who had been working the ER for almost 20 years and was known for her calm demeanor even in the most stressful situations. The page simply said, "Incoming trauma, ETA 5 minutes, possible drowning victim." I made my way to Trauma Bay 1, where Linda was already setting up equipment with 2 other nurses, Jennifer Walsh and Michael Torres. The paramedics had called ahead with preliminary information. Adult male, approximately 30 to 35 years old, found unconscious on the banks of the Winooski River by a late-night jogger. The patient was hypothermic, unresponsive, and showed signs of prolonged water exposure. "What's the water temperature been like?" I asked Linda as we prepared the warming blankets and IV fluids. "According to the Weather Service, the river's been running about 42 degrees this week. If he was in there for any significant time, we're looking at severe hypothermia." The ambulance arrived at 2:52 a.m. and the paramedics wheeled in a patient who immediately struck me as unusual. The man appeared to be in his early 30s with dark hair and pale skin that had the bluish tint typical of hypothermia. But what caught my attention first were his clothes, or rather, the complete absence of any identifying features on them. He was wearing dark jeans, a plain black sweater, and work boots, but every piece of clothing had been stripped of labels, tags, and any manufacturer markings. Even the boots had no brand names or size indicators. "What do we know about how he was found?" I asked the lead paramedic, Tom Bradley, who I had worked with dozens of times over the years. "Jogger found him around 2:15 a.m., lying face up on the riverbank about half a mile downstream from the Route 2 bridge. He was unconscious but breathing, soaking wet and cold to the touch. No ID, no wallet, no phone. We couldn't get a response from him at all. I began my initial assessment while the nurses worked to get him connected to monitors and warming equipment. His core body temperature was 89.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Dangerously low, but not the lowest I had seen in drowning cases. His pulse was slow but steady at 52 beats per minute, blood pressure was 95/60, and his oxygen saturation was surprisingly good at 96% on room air. But as I continued the examination, I began to notice things that didn't add up. For someone who had supposedly been found after nearly drowning in a river, his lungs sounded completely clear. There was no evidence of water aspiration, no rales or raunchy that would indicate fluid in the airways. His skin, while cold and pale, showed no signs of the prolonged water immersion you would expect. No pruning of the fingers and toes, no maceration of the skin. "Tom, how long did the jogger think he might have been there?" I asked. She said she had run the same route about 2 hours earlier and didn't see anything, so probably less than 2 hours. But the hypothermia suggests he was in the water for a while before making it to shore. I ordered a full trauma workup, chest x-ray, CT scan of the head and abdomen, complete blood count, comprehensive metabolic panel, arterial blood gas, and toxicology screen. While we waited for the results, I continued my physical examination and found more inconsistencies. The patient had multiple superficial scratches and abrasions on his arms and legs, consistent with being dragged through brush or over rocks. But the pattern of the injuries was strange. They were too uniform, too evenly distributed, as if they had been deliberately created rather than sustained accidentally. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, and no injuries consistent with hitting rocks or debris in a fast-moving river. "Dr. Harrison, his temperature is coming up faster than I would expect," Jennifer noted, checking the thermometer. "He's already up to 91.8 degrees. That was unusual. Severe hypothermia typically takes hours to reverse, even with aggressive warming measures. The human body doesn't recover from core temperatures in the 80s that quickly, especially not in someone who had supposedly been exposed to near-freezing water." The lab results came back around 3:45 a.m., and they only deepened the mystery. His blood work was completely normal. No signs of infection, no electrolyte imbalances, no evidence of drug or alcohol use. The arterial blood gas showed perfect oxygenation and acid-base balance, which was impossible for someone who had been hypoxic from drowning. The chest x-ray was clear, with no signs of pulmonary edema or aspiration pneumonia. Most puzzling of all, the CT scans showed a completely normal brain with no signs of hypoxic injury. When someone drowns or nearly drowns, the brain is typically the first organ to show damage from lack of oxygen. Even brief periods of hypoxia leave characteristic changes on imaging studies. This patient's brain looked like that of someone who had never experienced a moment of oxygen deprivation. "This doesn't make sense," I told Linda as we reviewed the results. "Everything about this case says drowning victim, but none of the clinical findings support that diagnosis. Could he have been hypothermic from something else? Exposure without water immersion? Possible, but then why was he soaking wet? And why was he found on the riverbank?" At 4:15 a.m., something happened that I had never experienced in 12 years of emergency medicine. The patient opened his eyes. I was standing at the foot of his bed, reviewing his chart, when I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. I looked up to find him staring directly at me with the most intense blue eyes I had ever seen. They weren't the confused, disoriented eyes of someone emerging from hypothermia and unconsciousness. They were alert, focused, and unnervingly intelligent. "Good morning," I said, moving closer to the bed. "I'm Dr. Harrison. You're in the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital. Do you remember what happened to you?" He didn't respond verbally, but his eyes followed my movements with perfect tracking. I pulled out my pen light to check his pupils, and he didn't flinch or blink when I shined the light directly into his eyes. His pupils were equal, round, and reactive, but there was something unsettling about the way he maintained eye contact throughout the examination. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked. No response, but he continued to watch me with those piercing blue eyes. "Do you know where you are?" Still no verbal response, but he turned his head slightly to look around the trauma bay, taking in the monitors, the IV poles, and the medical equipment with what appeared to be curiosity rather than confusion. I performed a neurological assessment, testing his reflexes, muscle strength, and coordination. Everything was normal, better than normal, actually. His reflexes were hyperactive, his muscle tone was perfect, and when I asked him to squeeze my fingers, his grip strength was remarkable for someone who had supposedly been unconscious and hypothermic just hours earlier. Dr. Harrison, Michael called from the monitor station. His vitals are completely normal now. Temperature 98.6, heart rate 72, blood pressure 120/80. It's like he was never hypothermic at all. That was medically impossible. The human body doesn't recover from severe hypothermia in 2 hours, especially not to the point of having completely normal vital signs. I had seen hypothermia patients take days to fully normalize their body temperature, and many of them suffered lasting effects from the cold exposure. I decided to try a different approach with the patient. Instead of asking direct questions, I began explaining what we had found and what we were doing to help him. You were brought in after being found unconscious by the Winooski River. You were very cold when you arrived, but you're warming up well now. All of your tests look good, which is encouraging. We're going to keep monitoring you for a while to make sure you're stable. As I spoke, I noticed that his expression changed subtly. It wasn't the blank stare of someone with a head injury or the confused look of someone emerging from unconsciousness. It was the focused attention of someone who was listening carefully and processing every word I said. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I asked. He nodded once, slowly and deliberately. "Are you in any pain?" He shook his head. "Are you having trouble speaking, or do you choose not to speak?" For the first time, his expression changed to what might have been amusement. The corner of his mouth turned up slightly, as if he found my question entertaining. I spent another 20 minutes with him, performing additional tests and trying different approaches to communication. He was clearly conscious and alert. He understood everything I said, and he could follow simple commands perfectly. But he never spoke a word, and there was something about his demeanor that made me increasingly uncomfortable. It wasn't just that he was uncooperative. I had dealt with plenty of uncooperative patients over the years. It was the way he seemed to be studying me, analyzing my reactions and responses as if I were the subject of some kind of experiment. Every time I asked a question or performed a test, I felt like he was evaluating my technique and finding it somehow inadequate. Around 5:30 a.m., I decided to step away from the patient and consult with Dr. Patricia Reeves, the attending physician who was supervising the night shift. Dr. Reeves had been practicing emergency medicine for over 20 years and had seen cases from all over New England during her career. "Patricia, I need a second opinion on the drowning case in Trauma 1, I said, finding her in the break room. I explained the inconsistencies in the patient's presentation, the impossible recovery from hypothermia, and the strange behavior since he had regained consciousness. Dr. Reeves listened without interrupting, but I could see the skepticism in her expression. "Marcus, you're describing a patient who is recovering better than expected from a cold water exposure. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Some people are more resilient than others. But the timeline doesn't make sense, and his neurological status is too good for someone who was found unconscious after a drowning incident. Have you considered that maybe he wasn't actually drowning? Maybe he was just cold and wet from being outside in the rain, and the jogger assumed he had been in the river?" It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't account for everything I had observed. "Come take a look at him yourself. There's something about this case that doesn't feel right." Dr. Reeves agreed to examine the patient, and we walked back to Trauma Bay 1 together. As we approached the bed, I noticed that the patient's attention immediately shifted to Dr. Reeves, and he watched her with the same intense focus he had shown me. "Good morning, doctor," Reeves said in her usual professional but warm tone. "I'm Dr. Reeves. Dr. Harrison has been taking excellent care of you." The patient's eyes moved between Dr. Reeves and me, and again, I had the unsettling feeling that he was analyzing our interaction, studying the dynamics between us. Dr. Reeves performed her own examination, testing the same reflexes and responses that I had checked earlier. Her findings were identical to mine. Everything was normal, perhaps too normal for the circumstances. "His recovery is remarkable," she admitted as we stepped away from the bed. "But I've seen unusual cases before. The human body can be surprisingly resilient." "What about the lack of any identification? The clothes with no labels? The pattern of injuries that don't match the supposed mechanism?" "Those are concerning, but they could have explanations. Maybe he's homeless and doesn't carry ID. Maybe he removes labels from his clothes for personal reasons. As for the injuries, river rocks and debris can create all kinds of unusual wound patterns." Dr. Reeves was trying to be rational and evidence-based, which I appreciated, but I could tell that she was also somewhat puzzled by the case. She agreed to keep the patient for observation and to contact the police to see if anyone had reported a missing person matching his description. I returned to the trauma bay around 6 a.m. to check on the patient one more time before my shift ended. He was sitting up in bed, fully alert, and his color had returned to completely normal. If I hadn't seen him arrive hypothermic and unconscious just 3 hours earlier, I would have thought he was a healthy man who had come to the ER for a routine complaint. "How are you feeling?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment, and then, for the first time since he had arrived, he smiled. It wasn't a warm or reassuring smile. It was the kind of smile that made me take an involuntary step backward. "I'm feeling much better, doctor," he said in a voice that was clear, articulate, and carried just a hint of an accent I couldn't identify. "Thank you for your excellent care." The fact that he could speak perfectly after hours of apparent mutism was startling enough, but there was something about his tone that made my skin crawl. He spoke like someone who was used to being in control, someone who was accustomed to having others defer to his authority. "I'm glad to hear that. Do you feel ready to tell us your name now?" Names are such limiting things, don't you think? They tie us to specific identities, specific histories. Sometimes it's better to simply be present in the moment. It was an odd response, but I pressed on. "We need to contact your family or friends to let them know you're safe. Someone must be worried about you." "I don't think that will be necessary. The police will want to speak with you about what happened. They need to file a report about the incident." His smile widened slightly. "I'm sure they do, but I don't think I'll be available for that conversation." There was something in his tone that sounded almost like a threat, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what made me feel that way. I decided to change the subject. "We'd like to keep you for observation for at least another day. Hypothermia can have delayed effects, and we want to make sure you're completely stable before you're discharged." "That's very thoughtful of you, doctor, but I don't think that will be necessary either." "I'm afraid it's not really optional. You were brought in unconscious, and we have a responsibility to ensure your safety." He studied me for a moment, and I had the distinct impression that he was deciding how much to reveal about his true intentions. "Dr. Harrison, you seem like an intelligent man. In your 12 years of emergency medicine, how many cases have you encountered that defied medical explanation?" I was startled that he knew how long I had been practicing. I was certain I hadn't mentioned that information to him, and it wasn't written anywhere visible in the trauma bay. "How did you know how long I've been practicing?" You carry yourself with the confidence of someone who has significant experience, but you still have the curiosity of someone who hasn't seen everything yet. 12 years seemed like a reasonable estimate. It was a plausible explanation, but something about it felt rehearsed, as if he had prepared an answer for that question. "To answer your question," I said, "I've seen a few cases over the years that were difficult to explain medically, but medicine is constantly evolving, and what seems inexplicable today often has a rational explanation tomorrow." How refreshingly optimistic. But what if I told you that some things truly are beyond the scope of your medical understanding? What if I told you that not everything that appears in your emergency room can be explained by pathophysiology and pharmacology? The conversation was taking a turn that made me deeply uncomfortable. I had dealt with psychiatric patients before, people who believed they had supernatural abilities or who thought they were being controlled by outside forces. But this man didn't seem delusional or psychotic. He seemed perfectly rational, which somehow made his words more unsettling. "I think we should focus on your medical care right now," I said. "We can discuss philosophy later." "Of course. You have other patients to see, other lives to save. I understand the demands of your profession." I left the trauma bay feeling more disturbed than I had ever felt after interacting with a patient. There was something fundamentally wrong about the entire situation, but I couldn't articulate what it was. The medical facts didn't add up. The patient's behavior was bizarre, and I had the persistent feeling that I was missing something important. My shift ended at 7 a.m., and I gave report to Dr. Jennifer Kim, who was taking over for the day shift. I explained the case in detail, emphasizing the unusual aspects of the patient's presentation and recovery. Dr. Kim listened carefully and agreed to continue monitoring him closely. "Has he given you any indication of when he might be willing to provide identification or contact information?" she asked. "He's been evasive about that. He seems intelligent and cooperative in some ways, but completely uncooperative in others. I get the feeling he's hiding something significant. I'll see what I can do. Sometimes patients are more willing to open up to a fresh face." I went home to my apartment about 10 minutes from the hospital, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the patient's impossible recovery, his strange behavior, and the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't have known. I had never had a case affect me this way, and I couldn't understand why this particular patient was bothering me so much. Around 2 p.m., I was finally starting to drift off to sleep when my phone rang. It was Dr. Kim. "Marcus, I need to ask you about the patient from last night, the one who was found by the river." "What about him?" "He's gone." I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, he's not here. Sometime between 11 a.m. and noon, he disappeared from the hospital. No one saw him leave, he didn't sign out against medical advice, and he left no trace that he was ever here." "That's impossible. He was in a hospital gown. He had no clothes, no shoes, no identification. How could he just disappear?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out. Security is reviewing the camera footage, but so far they haven't found anything. It's like he just vanished." I drove back to the hospital immediately, still wearing the clothes I had slept in. Dr. Kim met me in the emergency department and walked me through what they knew. The last time anyone remembers seeing him was around 10:30 a.m. when one of the nurses checked his vital signs. Everything was normal. He was alert and cooperative, and he said he was feeling fine. When the next nurse went to check on him at noon, the bed was empty. "What about his belongings?" "The clothes he came in with." "That's the strangest part. His clothes are gone too, but we had put them in a biohazard bag because they were wet and dirty. The bag is missing from the storage area." We walked to the trauma bay where he had been treated. The bed had been stripped and cleaned, ready for the next patient. There was no sign that anyone had ever been there. "Did anyone check the security footage from the hallways and exits?" "Security is working on it now, but they said the cameras in this section of the hospital have been having technical problems for the past few days. Some of the footage is corrupted or missing." That seemed like an impossible coincidence. Hospital security systems are designed with multiple redundancies specifically to prevent gaps in coverage. "What about the police? Did they ever come to interview him?" "They were supposed to come this afternoon. I called them to let them know he was gone, and they said they'd send someone over to take a report." Detective Robert Walsh arrived about an hour later to investigate the disappearance. He was a veteran investigator who had worked with the hospital on numerous cases over the years, and he approached the situation with professional skepticism. Dr. Harrison, Dr. Kim has filled me in on the basic facts, but I'd like to hear your account of the patient's condition and behavior. I walked Detective Walsh through everything I had observed, from the inconsistencies in the medical presentation to the strange conversation we had before my shift ended. He listened carefully, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Did he ever give you any indication that he was planning to leave? Not directly, but he was evasive when I told him we wanted to keep him for observation. He said it wouldn't be necessary, as if he had other plans. What about his mental status? Did he seem confused, disoriented, or impaired in any way? That's the thing. He seemed completely lucid and rational. Too rational, if that makes sense. He spoke like someone who was in complete control of the situation. Detective Walsh interviewed the nursing staff and reviewed what little security footage was available. The cameras that were working showed normal hospital activity, but there was no sign of the patient leaving his room or moving through the corridors. This is highly unusual, Detective Walsh admitted. People don't just disappear from hospitals without leaving some kind of trace. Even if he walked out on his own, someone should have seen him. What about the original incident? Did you find anything at the scene where he was discovered? I sent a team to check the riverbank this morning. They found the spot where the jogger said she discovered him, but there was no physical evidence, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing to indicate how he ended up there. The investigation continued for several days, but it yielded no answers. The jogger who had found the patient was interviewed extensively, but her story remained consistent. She had been running her usual route along the river when she saw what appeared to be a body on the bank. She called 911 immediately and waited with the patient until the paramedics arrived. The paramedics confirmed their original report. They had found an unconscious, hypothermic man with no identification. Their treatment and transport had been routine, and they had no explanation for his subsequent disappearance. Hospital administration launched their own internal investigation, focusing on security protocols and staff procedures. They found no evidence of wrongdoing or negligence, but they did discover that the security camera malfunctions had been more extensive than initially reported. Several cameras throughout the hospital had experienced technical problems during the same time period, creating multiple blind spots in the surveillance coverage. The IT department's analysis of the camera failures was inconclusive. The problems appeared to be related to software glitches rather than hardware malfunctions, but they couldn't determine what had caused the glitches or why they had occurred simultaneously across multiple systems. 3 weeks after the incident, I was still thinking about the case daily. I had trouble sleeping. I was distracted during my shifts, and I found myself questioning my medical judgment in ways I never had before. The rational part of my mind knew that unusual cases happened in medicine and that not every mystery had a satisfying explanation. But the emotional part of my mind couldn't let go of the feeling that I had encountered something that challenged my understanding of reality. I decided to do some research on my own, looking for similar cases in medical literature and news reports. What I found was both fascinating and disturbing. Over the past 5 years, there had been at least a dozen reports of patients with similar presentations at hospitals across New England. The details varied, but the pattern was consistent. Unidentified patients found in remote locations, presenting with symptoms that didn't match their supposed injuries, recovering impossibly quickly, and then disappearing without explanation. In most cases, the patients had been found near bodies of water. They typically had no identification, wore clothing without labels, and showed signs of exposure that didn't correlate with their clinical condition. Hospital staff described them as unusually alert and intelligent, often displaying knowledge that seemed inconsistent with their circumstances. In every case, the patients had disappeared from the hospital before they could be properly identified. Security footage was often corrupted, and investigations yielded no useful leads. The most disturbing aspect was the effect these cases seemed to have on medical staff. Several doctors and nurses had reported persistent anxiety and sleep disturbances after their encounters with these mysterious patients. A few had even left emergency medicine, citing burnout. I began to wonder if I was experiencing something similar. The case had affected me more profoundly than any other in my career, and I was starting to question whether I wanted to continue in emergency medicine. The final straw came about a month later, when I was working another night shift and received a call from the triage nurse. "Dr. Harrison, we have a patient in the waiting room who is asking for you specifically. What's the chief complaint? He says he doesn't have a medical emergency. He just wants to thank you for the excellent care you provided." My blood ran cold. I walked to the waiting room, and there he was. The same man, wearing different clothes, but unmistakably the same person. He was sitting calmly in one of the plastic chairs, reading a magazine, as if he were waiting for a routine appointment. When he saw me, he smiled that same unsettling smile and stood up. "Dr. Harrison, how nice to see you again. I hope you've been well. What are you doing here?" I told the nurse, "I wanted to thank you for your care. It's not often that I encounter someone with your level of dedication to understanding difficult cases. You need to leave. Now." "Of course. I just wanted you to know that your curiosity about my case was noted and appreciated. Not everyone would have been so thorough in their investigation." The implication was clear. He knew I had been researching similar cases. He knew I had been trying to understand what had happened that night. "Who are you?" "I think you already know the answer to that question, doctor. Or at least, you know that I'm not what I appeared to be." He turned and walked toward the exit, then paused and looked back at me. "You might want to consider a change of career, Dr. Harrison. Emergency medicine can be very stressful, especially when you encounter cases that challenge your worldview. Sometimes it's better to find a profession that deals with more predictable problems." He left the hospital, and I never saw him again. But his message was clear. He knew who I was, where I worked, and how his case had affected me. The encounter felt like a warning, though I couldn't be sure what I was being warned against. I submitted my resignation and moved to New Hampshire, where I work as a family physician. I treat routine problems, don't work nights, and avoid trauma cases. I've never told anyone the full story, partly because I don't think anyone would believe me, and partly because I don't want to attract attention from whoever that patient was. I still think about the case regularly. I wonder how many other doctors have encountered similar patients, and what would happen if someone investigated thoroughly. Most of all, I wonder if that patient was right, that some things are beyond medical understanding, and sometimes it's better not to ask questions about mysteries we encounter. I sleep better now, but I still check my locks twice before bed. Because somewhere out there, someone knows that I know their secret.